If Derek had not laughed in my face that Tuesday evening, if he had simply stayed quiet, taken his mother home, and let me grieve in peace, I would never have opened that drawer. And if I had never opened that drawer, I would have walked out of my own house with a suitcase in my hand, believing I deserved to. My name is Margaret Louise Holloway. I am 63 years old, and this is my true story from Sacramento, California. My husband, Raymond, died on a Thursday, a regular Thursday in March, which I think is the cruelest kind. No storm, no warning, just a phone call from a nurse at Mercy General who couldn't quite get the words to come out straight. We had been married for 34 years. We met at a records department. I was filing, he was auditing, and we never really stopped being in the same room after that. He was not a loud man. He was the kind of man who fixed the dripping faucet before you ever heard it drip, who left your coffee already made when you came downstairs, who never once in 34 years made me feel like I was a problem to be managed. When he died, the house went quiet in a way I didn't know a house could go quiet. I kept working because I had to, and because it was the only thing that felt like solid ground. I had spent 22 years in hospital records management, specifically in compliance and documentation, HIPAA audits, estate coordination, insurance claims processing. It was detailed, methodical work, and I was good at it. I understood what paperwork meant. I understood what signatures meant. I understood better than most people what a legal document was worth and what it could do. What I didn't understand, not yet, was how much I was going to need that knowledge. Our daughter, Renee, had married Derek 3 years before Raymond passed. He was the kind of man who smiled with just his mouth, who called Raymond sir, until the ring was on Renee's finger, and after that called him nothing at all. Raymond never said it plainly, but once, just once, he looked at me over the kitchen table and said, "Peggy, make sure you know where everything is." I thought he meant the Christmas ornaments. I did not understand what he was really telling me until much later. After Raymond died, Derek started coming to the house more. I told myself it was because Renee was worried about me. I told myself he was being a good son-in-law. I was alone. I was grieving. I was not sleeping well. The porch light had been flickering for 3 weeks, and I couldn't make myself call anyone to fix it because Raymond always fixed the porch light, and fixing it myself felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit. I told myself a lot of things that winter. Most of them were wrong. My routine those first months was simple. I worked the day shift at the hospital on Tuesdays and Thursdays, records and compliance, same as always. On the other days I cooked, cleaned, went through Raymond's files, and tried to eat dinner before 8 o'clock, which I usually failed at. My neighbor, Celeste, became my anchor. She was 71 years old, a retired schoolteacher, and a woman who had outlived a husband, a house fire, and a hip replacement, all with the same quiet dignity. She came over on Wednesdays. I always made soup, nothing fancy, whatever was in the pot. She always brought lemon cake from the bakery on Freeport Boulevard. We would sit at the kitchen table, eat, and talk about small things. Her garden, my work, the news, briefly, because neither of us could stand it for long. It was the most normal 2 hours of my week. She was the only person who never looked at me like I was fragile. Celeste had noticed things before I did. She mentioned it once casually, over soup. That black truck has been parked on the corner 3 times this week. Doesn't belong to anyone on this street. I told her it was probably a contractor. She looked at me with the exact expression a woman uses when she knows you're wrong, but loves you too much to say, so directly. I waved it off. I shouldn't have. The first thing I noticed and dismissed was the side gate. It had a latch that Raymond had put on specifically so it couldn't blow open in the wind. It required 2 hands to operate properly. In late April, About 6 weeks after Raymond's funeral, I came home from work to find it standing open. I closed it. I told myself the wind had been strong that afternoon. It had not been a windy day. The second thing I noticed was the filing cabinet in the spare bedroom. Raymond kept his personal papers there, the house documents, insurance policies, our financial records, his will. I had been through it once to find the life insurance policy, but I hadn't gone through it all. One afternoon, I opened the top drawer and found it slightly different from how I'd left it. Nothing missing that I could immediately identify, just slightly different. A folder not quite flush with the others. A rubber band on the wrong stack. I told myself I'd been distracted when I last looked. That grief does that to your memory. The third thing happened in May. Derek came by unannounced on a Saturday morning. Renee wasn't with him. He said he just wanted to check in. He walked through the living room in a way I can only describe as evaluating, not visiting. He looked at the built-in bookshelves Raymond had made. He ran his hand along the kitchen counter. He stood in the doorway to the spare bedroom for a moment, just looking. "Nice house," he said, in the tone of a man who is deciding whether or not to buy something. I said, "It is." He said, "Raymond was smart to keep it in good shape." Then he left. What he called a visit was inventory. I know that now. The fourth thing, and this one I should have run with, was something Renee said on the phone in early June. She sounded strained and careful, like a person reading from a script. She said Derek thought it might make financial sense for the house to eventually be restructured. She didn't define restructured. When I asked what she meant, she said they could talk about it later. We never did talk about it later, because Derek had a different timeline in mind. The warning I could not rationalize came on a Wednesday evening in July. Celeste and I had finished our soup. She was getting ready to leave. We were standing in the front hallway when she stopped and said very quietly, "Peggy, he was here again while you were at work. I saw him pull into the driveway. He had a key." I felt my stomach turn over slowly, like a stone rolling downhill. I said, "Derek?" She said, "He was inside for about 40 minutes. I wrote down the time." I asked how she knew he had a key. She said, "Because I watched him walk in without knocking." I sat down right there in the hallway. Celeste sat next to me. We didn't speak for a moment. Then she said, "I've been writing it down for 3 weeks. Every time he comes when you're not here." She had a small spiral notebook in her purse. She had the dates, the times, and in 2 cases, a brief description of what she saw through her front window. 3 entries, all on days I was at work. I held that notebook and understood for the first time that what was happening was not grief making me paranoid. It was someone using my grief as a door. It was a Tuesday evening, the second week of August. I remember it was still light at 7 o'clock, and the air smelled like cut grass from the neighbor's yard 2 doors down. I had just come home from my shift. I set my bag down in the front hall, took off my shoes, and heard voices in the kitchen. Derek was sitting at my kitchen table. His mother, Patricia, was standing near the counter with her arms folded. Renee was not there. Derek had a folder in front of him. He looked up at me the way a person looks up at someone who has just interrupted a meeting they were not invited to. He said, "We need to talk about the house, Margaret." I said, "This is my house." He opened the folder and pushed a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a document I had never seen, a typed letter with my name on it, outlining a proposed property transition arrangement. The language was dressed up, but what it said plainly was this: I was to vacate the property within 30 days. Derek and Renee would assume the mortgage and maintain the property going forward. I would be provided temporary housing assistance, which, when I read the fine print, meant a 6-month rental subsidy at a property that Derek's company managed. I looked at the paper for a long time without speaking. Derek said, You can't maintain this house on your own, Margaret. It's too much for you. You're alone. The sensible thing. I said, who told you this house has a mortgage? He blinked. I said it again, slowly. Who told you this house has a mortgage? Derek? His mother shifted her weight near the counter. Derek's jaw tightened, because here is what Derek did not know, or did not believe I knew. Raymond had paid off the mortgage 7 years before he died. The house was mine, free and clear, and it had been placed in my name, solely in my name, in a legal trust that Raymond had set up 4 years before his death, at the advice of a lawyer whose number was still in my phone. Raymond had not left me a message on the kitchen table. He had left me an unbreakable wall of documentation. When I did not respond to the paper, Patricia said from the counter, "Margaret, don't be difficult. You're not getting any younger. This is just practical." And then she laughed. It was a small, dismissive sound, the laugh of a woman who has never once in her life thought another woman would push back. My blood went cold. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I said, "I need you both to leave my house right now." Derek said, "We're not finished." I said, "I am." After they left, I stood in my kitchen for a long time. Then I went to the spare bedroom. I opened the filing cabinet, and I began to read. Raymond's lawyer, a woman named Cynthia Park, had drawn up the trust in 2019. I had signed the documents. I remembered signing them, but I had trusted Raymond to manage the details, the way you trust the person who fixed the dripping faucet before you ever heard it drip. I had not read every page. That night, I read every page. The house was in a revocable living trust, retitled to me as the sole surviving trustee upon Raymond's death. The transfer had been completed and filed with Sacramento County in March, 6 weeks after Raymond passed. There was no mortgage. There was no joint ownership with Renee or anyone else. There was no legal mechanism by which Derek could compel me to do anything. That document Derek had put in front of me, that property transition arrangement, was not a legal filing. It was a piece of paper he had typed and printed and expected me to sign without reading. I thought about the open gate, the rearranged file cabinet, the 40-minute visits while I was at work. He had been looking for this trust document. He had been looking to see whether it existed and what it said. And because he never found it in the cabinet, because I had given the original to Cynthia Park's office for safekeeping, which is standard practice, which I knew because I worked in records management for 22 years, he had decided the document either didn't exist or that I didn't know what it said. He had looked at me, a 63-year-old widow who cried sometimes when she woke up and kept her porch light on all night, and he had decided I was easy. What I thought was grief, he had mistaken for surrender. The next morning I called Cynthia Park. She confirmed that the trust was fully in effect and that the property transfer was on file with the county. Then she said something that stopped me cold. She said, "Margaret, did Raymond ever mention that Derek had contacted our office?" I said he had not. She said that 4 months before Raymond died. 4 months. Derek had called her office under the pretense of asking general questions about estate planning for a family member. He had not identified himself as Renee's husband initially. He had asked specifically about revocable living trusts, survivorship rights, and whether trusts of that type could be contested by adult children or spouses of children. He had been planning this before Raymond was in the ground. Cynthia told me she had flagged the call internally at the time because of the specific questions being asked and had noted it in the file. She had not told Raymond, which she now regretted. She had assumed it was idle curiosity. She did not assume it was a 4-year plan. I sat in my kitchen with the phone against my cheek and looked at the table where Raymond used to leave my coffee already made. It had never been impulsive. It had been a strategy built on one assumption, that a grieving old woman would not fight back. He had never accounted for what I did for 22 years. He had never accounted for Celeste's notebook, He had never accounted for Raymond's lawyer keeping records. The cage had never been locked. It had only been believed. I did not see myself as a hero. I saw this as the last chance to keep another person from paying for my silence. Because here is what Cynthia told me as we kept talking that morning. Derek's company managed several rental properties throughout Sacramento County. There had been 2 previous complaints filed with the California Department of Real Estate, both involving elderly tenants, both involving lease agreements with terms that did not match what tenants had been verbally told. Neither complaint had gone far, because neither tenant had pushed. Both had been women. Both had been over 60. Both had eventually moved out. I was not going to be the third. I spent the next 4 days doing what I had done for 22 years. I built a file. I gathered the trust documents from Cynthia's office. I obtained a certified copy of the county property record showing the title transfer. I compiled the dates, times, and descriptions from Celeste's spiral notebook, which she had already made a photocopy of and offered without my asking, because Celeste, it turns out, had been ready for this longer than I had. I documented the unauthorized entries with the dates. I knew Derek had entered the property without my consent, and I had Celeste provide a signed written statement. I contacted the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department and spoke with a detective in the civil unit who told me that what Derek had done, entering my property without permission on multiple dates, using a key I had not provided, constituted criminal trespass under California Penal Code Section 602. I filed a formal report. I called a locksmith the same afternoon. Every lock in the house was changed within 2 hours. I did not tell Derek. I did not tell Renee, not yet. I needed the record to be clean before I had any conversation with my daughter, because my daughter was not my enemy, and I needed to remember that even while I was building the case against her husband. Cynthia Park sent Derek a formal cease and desist letter on a Thursday morning. It outlined, precisely and without emotion, the following: that the property was held in trust in my name alone, that no documents signed outside of that trust held any legal weight, that he had entered the property without authorization on at least 3 documented occasions, that a police report had been filed, and that any further attempt to pressure, coerce, or misrepresent ownership of the property would result in legal action, including a civil claim and referral to the California Department of Real Estate regarding the prior complaints on file. Derek called my phone 4 times that afternoon. I did not answer. He came to the house on Friday evening. I watched through the window. He rang the bell. He knocked. He tried his key and found it no longer worked. He stood on the porch for 3 minutes with his hands on his hips and his jaw tight. I opened the door. He said loudly, "Margaret, this is not over." I said, "Derek, you confused my patience with permission. That mistake is going to cost you. You have Cynthia's letter. I suggest you read it with a lawyer." He said, "You're going to regret this." I said, "I spent 34 years building a life in this house. You spent 4 years assuming I didn't know what I owned. One of us is going to regret something. It isn't me." I closed the door. His footsteps left the porch. His car pulled away. I stood in the front hallway for a moment, the same hallway where Celeste and I had sat on the floor 2 weeks before, when I first understood what was happening. Then I went to the kitchen and made coffee. 3 months later, Renee and I had lunch at a restaurant on J Street. It was the first time we had been alone together since everything came out. She cried. I held her hand. I told her that what happened between her and Derek was between them, and that I was not going to make her choose, but that I was also not going to pretend it hadn't happened. She said she hadn't known about the calls to Cynthia's office. I believed her because Renee is not a woman who plans things. She is a woman who follows people who do, and I told her gently that she needed to be more careful about who she followed. She's in counseling now. That's all I'll say about that. The California Department of Real Estate opened a formal investigation into Derek's rental company. I don't know where that stands. I'm not the one driving it anymore. The record is in the right hands. Celeste, and I still have soup on Wednesdays. She still brings lemon cake from the bakery on Freeport. Last week she told me her granddaughter had called for the first time in 2 years, and she cried over her soup a little, and I did not say anything, just put my hand on hers, because sometimes that is enough. I had the porch light fixed in September. It was the first thing I fixed by myself. The electrician who came was a young man named Marcus, who told me his grandmother lived 2 streets over. He was careful and quick and didn't speak to me like I was fragile. I still work at the hospital. I still drink tea when my hands feel unsteady. I still hear the house differently in the early mornings, the creak of the hallway, the hum of the refrigerator, the way the light comes in at 7 o'clock in a way that I know Raymond loved. But I no longer believe that quiet is the same as weakness. And I no longer believe that being loved means being protected. Sometimes it means being left a legal trust and a lawyer's phone number and trusting yourself enough to use it. Before I end, I want to leave you with 5 lessons this story taught me. The first lesson: control rarely announces itself. It didn't arrive with shouting. It arrived with a key I hadn't given, a drawer left slightly open, a visit when I wasn't home. Pay attention to the small things. The small things are where the strategy lives. The second lesson: silence is not neutral. Every time I waved off a concern, the open gate, the rearranged files, the truck on the corner, I was giving away a little more ground. I confused politeness with peace. They are not the same thing. Noticing what is wrong and choosing not to act is still a choice, and it has a cost. The third lesson: documentation is power. Celeste's notebook, Raymond's trust, Cynthia's phone records, the county filing. None of those things required courage or confrontation. They required attention and patience and the understanding that truth, once recorded, does not disappear. Write it down. Keep copies. Know what you own. The fourth lesson: grief is not weakness, but it is an open door, and some people will walk through it. The people who are most dangerous are not the ones who hate you. They are the ones who simply do not believe you are paying attention. Raymond knew I was paying attention. He built me a wall before he left. I just had to trust myself enough to stand behind it. And the fifth lesson: healing is not loud. It is a porch light finally fixed. It is soup on a Wednesday. It is your daughter crying over lunch, and you holding her hand anyway. It is the first morning you wake up and realize you are not afraid of your own quiet house. You are grateful for it. That is what changing everything overnight really means. Not one dramatic moment, a decision made in a hallway, carried out one document at a time. What lesson did you take from this story? And what city are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below.